Well, good morning, Countryside. It is so good to be together this morning. I'm Pastor Nate, the new executive and discipleship pastor. I have met a lot of you. We're still meeting and getting to know each other, but man, it is so good. I said it last week, but thank you so much for the way you have welcomed our family into this church community, for the hospitality that's been shown, and just the joy that we have felt as we've entered into this community with you. So we're continuing this morning in a series that Mark kicked off a few weeks ago. We've been walking through basically just about verse by verse through the book of James. And if you guys are kind of in a similar situation to what I am, as we've been walking through this, we get to a certain point, and this is that point where we're like, man, James, this is hard, right? There's like the things that we've been called to, the behaviors and the way of living and all these things. We look at it, it's like, I don't know how we could possibly do all the things that James, as he just goes verse by verse, just this like relentless push toward this way of living. And so we get to this moment, and now we're moving into the second part of James chapter 2, and it's like, man, this just keeps getting more and more difficult. One of the things that is maybe for us so unsettling is that when we get to this point, we realize that James is not allowing us to make a distinction between like faith or our spiritual lives and our real life, right? That for some of us, we kind of navigate in this sort of way where we say, so this is my spiritual life, or this is my faith, this is my relationship with God, but then this is actually the way I make decisions and the way that I process life and the way that I move forward and all these kinds of things. And what we realize is as we walk through this book, as we walk through this letter that James is writing to the church, is that we just don't get to make that sort of distinction. And so he doesn't let us off the hook. The framework for this, or to provide a foundation for this message, for this section of James this morning, we look and we say, so wouldn't it be so much easier? Wouldn't it be so much easier if all we had to do was know the right things? Right? Wouldn't it be so much easier if all we had to do was just know about stuff? That it wouldn't matter so much that we actually did anything with it, but man, if it was like we get to the end of this and we stand before God and we talk about our lives, that it's just this multiple choice, or maybe matching, or maybe fill in the blank with some really great hints that help us get the question right, that it's just about what we know. The problem is it's not just that our spiritual lives or our faith doesn't work like that. Real life doesn't work like that either, does it? I recently read an article talking about, of all things, the running of the bulls. Right? Have you guys ever watched this or seen it's just a wild kind of thing where here's this city in Spain, and they open up the streets and they release bulls, and they're running through the streets, and then there's people who think it's a great idea to actually like run in front of the bulls. Right? It's like this whole thing that people do, and so they're running, and there actually are experts in the running of the bulls. Did you know this? That there are people who know enough about how to run with the bulls that they actually write books about how to survive the running of the bulls. Right? You can get on Amazon and find these books. Well, 2014, an expert in the running of the bulls was running with the bulls. Okay. And as he's running, there's it kind of feels like maybe this whole thing is over, the event is over. Well, there was one bull that was straggling behind the rest of the pack. And so here's this guy who knew so much about the running of the bulls that he co-authored a book called How to Survive the Running of the Bulls. Okay? And so this co-author of this book is there kind of at the end of this thing, and then the straggling bull comes in and it gores him. Right, which is, he survived and recovered and all those kinds of things. But in a later interview, the gentleman who co-authored the book with this unfortunate gentleman said, perhaps we need to update the book. Right? The thrust is, it's just not enough to know a lot about something. Right? It's not enough just to be an expert, so much so that you actually could write a book or co-author a book about a thing. You actually have to know how to do, and you actually have to experience that thing. Real life doesn't work in the way that we wish it would sometimes, where it's if we just knew all the things. We actually have to put it into practice. And so James, as we move into the text, James chapter 2, starting in verse 14, there should be a QR code that if you're wanting to take notes along or follow along in that way that you can use. But James understands. That's one of the beautiful things about this book is that James is a human being also, just like us, right? He's wrestled with these kinds of things. He's living life, swimming in very similar kinds of waters to what we swim in. Like culturally way different and a part of the world way different, but with the human condition on full display as he's seeking to live his life faithfully. So he understands and he anticipates the challenges that we experience. He understands and anticipates the tension that we feel when it comes to how should we live and what's required of us and what does it look like to live our lives in faithful response to what Jesus has done for us. So he anticipates the challenge, but what's hard about this is he knows us, right? He knows what humans are like because he is one. But he doesn't let us off the hook. He keeps pushing, right? This is part of why this series, as we're walking through it and working through it, is it's so relentless because I understand where you're coming from, and I can kind of read you guys like a book because I'm one of you. I've experienced this, and I've walked through this, but man, we're not going to stop there. We're going to keep pushing forward. And so he anticipates the challenge, but he doesn't let us off the hook. And so James, because he cares, because he's wanting to help us not just know the right answer, but live into the right kinds of questions, asks a series of questions throughout this passage that really get to two big questions. The first one is this: what if knowing everything isn't enough? Right? What if knowing everything isn't enough? And then the other question: what if doing good things? What if doing good things isn't enough? Right? What if it's not enough just to know all the things and to be right about everything and to have everything figured out? And what if it's not enough to just do all sorts of good things? And so he starts in James chapter 2, starting in verse 14. He says this: what good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but don't show it by your actions? Right? What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Right? Two big questions that set up a much longer conversation. Two questions that create the kind of tension that forces us to really wrestle with the reality of how we're living our lives. What is it that we're doing? What is it that we value? How is it that we respond to what has been done for us? And then he puts a fine point on it initially with the first of a few examples that he'll use throughout this passage. He says, suppose this, right? Now he's making it very personal for us. Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say, goodbye, have a good day, stay warm, and eat well. He says, but then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do, right? Talking about what good does a faith that's just knowing the information, right? To address a situation with someone that we're interacting with, it's just being aware of the conditions of their lives, just being aware of their circumstances, being aware of their needs, but not actually doing anything about it. And so James says, so what good does that do anyone? And that doesn't do any good for you, right? Because there's no expression of your faith, but it also doesn't do any good for the person who has need, who is in need of your good deeds, and all you do is say, goodbye, stay warm, be filled. He says that kind of faith is not going to make a difference in your life, and it's not making a difference in the lives of those around you. So this is the first of three examples that James gives to force us not just to think about something differently, but to actually wrestle with how do we live this out, right? What does it look like for us to actually put this into practice? And then the problem. James chapter 2, verse 17, he says, so you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. Faith by itself isn't enough. And so we pause and we look at this tension that James is describing, that this moment, and he doesn't say faith doesn't matter, right? He doesn't say that it doesn't matter what we believe. He says it's on its own, it's not enough. It's important for us to know what we believe about God. It's important for us to believe rightly about God, for us to be in right relationship with God, to live life in connection with God. But he says that by itself, without the outcome, without the expression of that from our lives into the world around us, is not enough. Faith is important. It's the beginning of this Christian journey, right? It sets it off, and it's also the means by which the Christian journey is sustained. It's the means by which we lean into the grace and the mercy of God as we seek to live faithfully and fruitfully in the world around us. So faith is important. But what we do is important too, right? Works are important too. Works, the good deeds that we do in response to what God has done for us, the things that we do as we see the needs in the world around us, the way that we respond to the situations and circumstances that we find ourselves in. What we do matters. Works are important too. This is faith unleashed in our lives. This is what it looks like for us to lean into and to take hold of the call that God has placed on us. And so James chooses a word intentionally. He's talking about faith and works. And the word that he's using is a word that we translate works, but it's useful work, right? It's not just inactivity, it's action in place of inactivity. It's useful action in place of useless action, right? Or meaningless activity, useless busyness. That it's purposeful action. It's, we're not just like running around doing all sorts of things, but we're saying, what is the need? And what is it that needs to happen? What is it that looking at the world around me and looking at the person in front of me, what is it that needs to happen in this situation? And then acting and responding in a useful and helpful sort of way. Right? So he says, so it's faith and it's work. Not just keeping ourselves busy, not just trying to impress God with all the things that we're doing, but saying, so if this is what the needs are in the world around me, if this is what needs to happen, then I want to be in on something useful in response to the needs around me. Not useless busyness, but useful action. And so what we see is that the tension that maybe feel with faith and works isn't so much a tension between faith and works. For us, as we sort this out in our lives, as we wrestle this down, as we seek to be faithful in living this out. But it's actually a distinction between faith that has works and faith that doesn't have works, right? The expression, the evidence, the outcome actually matters. And so as James writes this letter to the church, as he encourages the Christians he's writing to say, so this is what it looks like for you to live out in your context, the way of Jesus, and he gives all these the sorts of commands that he's describing as this letter unfolds. He seems to have three possible ways of living in mind. The first one is this, that someone may choose to live or may be finding themselves living in a way that it's faith without works. Which, if you want to put a parenthetical statement next to that, that's useless, right? It's faith without works. It's not actually doing anything. That actually isn't functioning in a helpful or fruitful kind of way in our lives. Faith without works. The other way that he's looking, or the second way that he's looking as a possibility for how to live our lives, is works without faith. Right? This is doing all the things. This is trying to do good. We see this happening in the world around us. We find ourselves maybe sometimes doing this same sort of thing when we're almost working out our anxieties about our relationship with God by just trying to do enough things to impress Him. Maybe for some of us, we've lived our lives just trying to do enough good things to balance the scale in our favor as we think about our relationship with God. It's like I've done some bad things, but man, if I can do enough good things, then I can make myself right with God. Or maybe it's just we're trying to set up some sort of transaction with God where it's if I just do enough, then surely God will do for me what I want God to do for me. Works without faith, without this rootedness in the relationship with God, works without faith, without a deep and meaningful connection with God is meaningless, right? If faith without works is useless, then works without faith is without meaning. And then there's the third way, the way that James seems to be pushing us to embrace in our lives, faith that has works. Faith where there is actual evidence of a transformed life. And we would say parenthetically, this is the right way, right? This is the way that James would say, this is how we live in a faithful and fruitful kind of way in the world around us. This is what we will describe as we work our way through this passage as active faith. This is where we take faith and we say, so if this is what I believe about God, if this is what I believe about the relationship that I have with Him, if this is what God has done for me, then I'm not going to just leave it in the sphere of faith. I'm going to take my faith, I'm going to apply it to the act of living, right? In lots of different ways that this plays out, in the way we make decisions, and the relationships that we have, and how we interact with each other, that we take faith, and it's not just that we have faith, but we apply faith, right? We have a right way of seeing God, a right way of understanding our relationship with Him, and we apply it to the act of living so that it's actually lived out and walked out in a meaningful and fruitful kind of way. Active faith is faith unleashed in our lives, right? Faith applied to the act of living is faith unleashed in our lives. And for just a second, we'll tease this out. It is safe. It is safe to pick faith or works, right? Faith or deeds, faith or the things that we do. whichever one is most comfortable to us. For some of us, it's this head, it's the faith, it's the what I believe, and then for some of us, it's man, I want to be busy, I want to be doing the things, I want to try and do enough things to please God, or do enough things to balance the scales in my favor, so that I'm in control of this relationship, right? So it's safe for us to pick the thing that's in our comfort zone, whether that's faith or works, the thing that keeps us in our comfort zone or keeps us in control of our lives. At least that we sense we're in control of our lives. It is safe to pick one. It is wild, right? It is wild to take hold of both, to lean in and say, I want everything that God has for me. I want to lean in and take hold of everything that God has for me and for the way that I live my life. I'm going to take hold of faith. I'm going to take hold of who God is and what God has done for me. And then I'm also going to take hold of the call that he's placed on my life, and in particular kinds of ways and in general kinds of ways to take hold of and say, God, whatever it is that you want to do in me and through me, God, I want to get in on that. And it's this lean in and take hold, and it is a wild, wild way of living. It doesn't let us just step back and say, well, I feel most comfortable with, or I feel most control when I am. But it's a lean in, wild kind of thing, because God's going to take us the kinds of places that we can't even fathom when we begin that journey. Unleashed is wild, right? We wouldn't need a leash if it wasn't wild, if it was tame. And this is for James, as he's having this conversation with the church, as now 2,000 years later, we're listening in. This is for James what he understands to be a lean in or lean out moment. Or we've all maybe found ourselves in conversations with friends or conversations with people where we're interested in what's being said. And so as we are more interested, we lean into the conversation, right? We lean into what's being said, and we're nodding in agreement, where this is interesting to me, and I'm wanting to lean in and get involved in and be part of this thing. And then we also have moments where it's like this conversation just took a turn, and I'm not sure I want to be part of it anymore. Right? That's the lean out. And so James anticipates this. We see this in conversations as we read through the Gospels, and we see conversations where Jesus has with people, and it's the disciples, you'll see it happen. They're leaning in, and they're listening to what Jesus has to say, and then he'll say something that takes them in a direction that maybe they're not yet comfortable with, and you can just feel the air as they lean out. And so James anticipates that this is one of those lean in or lean out moments, that this is going to be a decision point for us as we sort out how we will respond to what he's saying. And so he anticipates the lean out. Not only does he anticipate the lean out, he anticipates the kind of argument that we might make to justify the lean out. He says, now someone, verse 18, now someone may argue some people have faith and others have deeds, right? This is James teasing out this idea that some people say, well, look, my comfort zone or my sweet spot or the place that I'm most familiar with is one or the other. It's faith or it's deeds. He says, so someone, right? We're not going to talk about you or me. We're not going to talk about a specific person, but James is giving us the benefit of just saying we're going to talk in general about a person who might say a thing, right? That way we can step back and critique it without it becoming a personal kind of conflict between us. He says someone. He's drawing out this argument by setting up this hypothetical conversation. And someone may say it's one or the other, just depending on how we're wired or what we're comfortable with or what keeps us in control. He says, but I say, right now he's going to take on and directly confront this idea. He says, but I say, how can you show me your faith? How can you show me your faith if you don't have good deeds? Right? How can you show me what you believe? How can you show me what God is doing in you if there's no expression, there's no evidence that reveals the work of God active in your life? He says, how can you show me your faith if you don't have good deeds? He says, I will show you my faith by my good deeds. Right? The evidence matters. The expression of God at work in us into the world around us, it matters. It's how we reveal and show what God is doing in us is by the way we allow him to work through us. And then James keeps pushing, right? This is why we get to this point in this series where it's like, okay, this is a lot, right? This is getting difficult. He keeps pushing because now he moves from someone, and then he talks about himself, and now he points the finger and says, and you. Verse 19, you say you have faith, for you believe that there is one God. Good for you. Right, if there was like a sarcasm font in the Bible, this would be written in that font, right? It was like, good for you, like, great, okay, good for you. Even the demons believe this, and they tremble in terror, right? So what he's referring to is belief, right? The belief in the way that someone who has been part of the people of God for generation upon generation, there's practices that had been established. And one of those practices was something understood as the Shema, or called the Shema, which is Sound theology. It's a practice that someone who was a good Jewish follower of God, that they would say a couple times a day, kind of like what we maybe would look at as the Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven, that for them this was that version of that, where they would a couple times a day pause at whatever they were doing and they would say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." And there were some other components to it, but it was a practice that they would do to remember what it was that they believed, to frame their day and to let their day be formed by right belief, by belief accurately in who God was, accurately about the God who is distinct from all the other gods that everybody else was trying to claim as God. Saying, this is who our God is. This is what is true of him. And this is the way that I live my life. I know these things. And so what James is saying is, you believe that there is one God. He's drawing from the language that would have been a consistent practice for someone who believed rightly. Drawn from Deuteronomy chapter 6, this generation upon generation upon generation practice and speaking of sound theology. But the good for you, the reason why there's the sarcasm in this, he says, but it's not enough, right? To simply believe that the Lord our God is one, to live in a way that you believe this thing is true, but if it doesn't actually affect the way you live, if it doesn't actually impact the way you live, then it's not enough. He said even the demons have like at least good theology, but now they don't have a good relationship with God. They're living in complete rebellion against him. But they at least believe rightly about God. They believe he's one also. So he says it's not enough to simply agree with what's true. What matters is how we live it. What matters is what we do with what we believe. And he says, how foolish. How foolish. Can't you see that faith without good deeds is useless? Right? Faith without deeds is useless. And so he's calling the concept of faith without action what it is. He's calling it foolish. He's calling it useless. He's saying, so if this is the way that you're operating, if this is what you think is true, if this is the way you think the world works, then let's just call this concept, this idea, this way of operating what it is. It's foolish and it's useless and it's going to prove fruitless. But the good news is he doesn't just leave us with this hopeless kind of situation of saying, well, but if this is how I'm operating, what do I need to do differently? Where do I go from here? What should I do in replacement of this way of living? There is a better way. Because active faith, right? Active faith, applying of faith to the act of living, active faith is knowing and doing. Right? There is a better way than just simply knowing. There is a better way than just doing, but like not connected in a meaningful way with what's true. Active faith takes both of these, right? It grabs hold of both, and it's the knowing and it's the doing. And so let's take just a moment and pay attention to the cultural waters that we swim in. We, as a people, are in an age of the world, a time in history that we would understand as the information age, right? We gather information, we fight over information, we fight over truth, we fight over these kinds of things because information is powerful, knowledge is powerful. We live in the information age, but we also live in an information nation, right? That the United States, America, is obsessed with information. So much so that we find ourselves, and I'm absolutely certain I'm not alone in this, we find ourselves scrolling our news feeds. Right? We have social media, we have these kinds of things, and we're scrolling our news feeds not to connect, but to know, right? To know information, to see what other people are doing, to see what other people are saying, what other people are thinking, what other people are posting, not to connect with them, not always. Right? Not to always connect with them, but to know and maybe to argue over and to gain information. And it's important, right? Mark talked about some of the things that this morning that we need to be aware of, right? That we have to be paying attention to. It is important for us to be informed. It's important for us to have information. But it's not enough, right? It's not enough just to know about things. What will we do with what we know? Our response and our reaction to the information that we have matters. The problem is that we're so easily satisfied that we stop with just gaining information. According to a recent Gallup poll, 92%, this might be surprising to some of us as we think about this, 92% of Americans believe in God. Right? So almost everybody, we look at the way the world operates, and we look at it and say, I'm not sure there's evidence that, that I don't think it's only 8% of the world that's causing all sorts of trouble at this point. But when we look and say 92% of people in some way, maybe they're not using God in the same, I would imagine many of them wouldn't define God in the same way that we're talking about. We're using the same word, but we're not talking about the same thing. But they may mean very different things when they say they believe in God, but they're at least acknowledging that there is something bigger, that there is something higher than them. They may not, probably not, as we watch and see this plays out, they may not be ready to call themselves Christians or like identify themselves in relationship with God or be living in a healthy way in relationship with God. But they at least believe that there is something bigger and higher than them. And so we're swimming in this water, right? We're gathering information. We're learning things. We're swimming in the water where people at least have a sense that there is something more, that there's a sense that there's something greater and higher. And it leaves us with the question, how do we know, right? How do we know that our faith is real? Right? How do we know that things are coming together as they should, that our lives are reflecting the call that God has placed on us? It's the outcome. Right? It's the what we do with what we know. It's the what we do with the faith that we have. It's what we do with the relationship that we have with God. The expression of our faith into our lives and into the lives of those around us. It's the expression of faith in our lives. And so then James continues as he's teasing this out in his time and in his day and his cultural context. And he talks about two characters that the people who were reading this letter would have been familiar with, Abraham and Rahab. And if you trace their stories, and we're not going to walk through the entirety of their stories this morning, but if you trace their stories, you see that these are two people who come from very, very different places, come from very different ways of living, from very different choices that have led them to certain ways of living and different circumstances and different cultural contexts. But if you trace almost every category that you would categorize people by, these two, you would not put them together in many categories, except one. Faith lived out, right? What they believe about God, and then a willingness to actually apply it to the act of living, to actually apply it to the decisions that they make and the way that they respond and the way that they follow in obedience as God asks them and invites them into a different way of living or into certain responses of obedience. Because active faith is the evidence of God at work in us. These are two unlikely characters, right? Abraham and Rahab, two unlikely characters to ever find themselves in the same category. But James chooses these two stories because it reveals the wisdom of God. A few years ago, I was in conversation with a friend of mine who owned a construction company, building custom homes and those kinds of things. And he was wrestling with this big call that God had seemed to be placing on his life. This call that would take him to Africa to do all these like big kinds of gestures and the kinds of things that as he reflected on and listened to God, that, man, it's like this is just something way bigger than I'm ever qualified to do. And so he's talking to me about this thing that he's been called to. He's teasing this out, and we're sharing coffee and we're having conversation. And in the midst of this conversation, God gave me wisdom to speak into this decision that this man was making. And I said, okay, so you're saying you're not qualified. Right? You're saying that you're not sure you're really like qualified to do the thing that God is asking you to do. I said, so you own a construction company, right? And he said, I do. And I said, and so say you're like off to a meeting or you're heading home at the end of the day and you remember as you're like on the road leaving a job site that there is something really, really important that needs to happen. That there is something that man, it cannot wait until tomorrow and it just simply has to be done and it has to be done right now. I said, so you have your phone out, right? And you're now thinking, okay, who is it that I'm going to call? I said, would you call, if you have like two options, one is someone who knows all the things about the problem that you're talking about, right? One who might even like really, really agree with the fact that this is an issue and needs to be dealt with and there's like a real problem and they're going to talk to you and you're on the phone and you're like this long conversation and by the time you get done, it's very clear that there is agreement on the issue. But that person may or may not actually follow through with what you're asking them to do, right? They know all the things. So, or you have the option two, You have someone who maybe doesn't know all the subtleties of the reasoning why this needs to happen. They don't have like all the same qualifications. They're not like exactly like up to speed on all the specifics of the situation. But man, you know, if you call them, if they pick up the phone and you say, okay, I'm going to walk you through this. Here's what I need you to do. And you know without a doubt that they're going to do that thing. Which one are you going to call? The one who seems to be the most qualified, or the one who you know will follow through? And he said, well, that's easy. Of course, I'm going to call the one who I know is going to get it done. And I said, so God is placing this big task in front of you. He's calling you to this thing where you're saying, man, I know I'm not the most qualified one. But God, in his wisdom, is looking out over the world and saying, this thing needs to be done. This task needs to be accomplished. I'm going to get a hold of, and I'm going to invite into this big solution to this big problem that the one who I know maybe isn't the most qualified, but man, when I call them, they're going to get it done, right? They're going to lean in. They're going to respond in obedience. And so these two characters, Abraham and Rahab, all sorts of different qualifications, all sorts of different categories that they might find themselves in. But the wisdom of God says, I'm going to call and invite the one who's going to follow through, the one who responds with obedience. Because it's less about qualifications and it's more about obedience and action. So James closes this section of James chapter 2 by saying this: just as the body is dead without breath, so also is faith dead without good works. Not just fruitless, he says it's dead. It's not a living faith. And before we move on, I'm just going to pause for a second and make it clear. James is not celebrating death. He's not dwelling on this spiritual death or this faith that is dead. He's laying it out and clarifying it, calling it what it is, so we can pause and we can take a step back and say, I want a living faith. Right? He's way more interested. He's not just interested in beating up the dead version of faith, but he's doing this and he's making it clear so that we can get a clear picture of what living faith looks like. He's making the distinction between them clear so that we can make a decision about the way that we're actually going to live. Because active faith is a living faith. Right? It's us actually applying faith to the act of living. It is an operating system change. Active faith, when we have faith that actually makes a difference, it's like you picture our phones, and it's like we have an app that we install on our phone. That's one way of doing things. He says this is an actual complete operating system change. This is like changing from Apple to Android, right? It's not just an app that we install into the rest of our lives. This is a radically different way of living, right? Because we live in the information age, right? We live in an information nation. We live in a place where knowledge and what we know and what we think, it becomes such a priority. He says, so we need to have an operating system change where we actually live differently, that we operate differently in response to what Jesus has done for us, which is the key, because this is not us trying to get God to do something. This is not a transaction that we're establishing or negotiating with God. This is us saying, because Jesus did for me what I never could have done for myself, then I'm going to live differently in response, that everything that we do is in response to what has been done for us. Because active faith, right, when we get this right, active faith is a credible witness. So James, in the beginning of this letter, as he's addressing this letter, if we look at the very beginning of James chapter 1, we see that he talks about writing this letter to the church who is spread out across the globe, right? Who's been chased all over the place because of persecution and being mistreated, and they're just a scattered kind of people. And what James is saying is, this is how you live in a credible way. So it's not just that you're enduring through persecution or you're just kind of like biding your time until the cultural winds change and the water is a little different and you can operate in favor. But he says this is how we live so that the story of Jesus, so that the invitation to life in him is shown in a credible way as you are dispersed across the world. That it's not just that you're pushed to the margins, but that you're spreading the story of Jesus. Living as credible witnesses in a world that, just like today, desperately needs to see people live this out in a credible kind of way. And so as we get to know each other, and we're starting to get to know each other, I had some fun conversations with some of you as we've settled into our lives here at Countryside and here in Spearfish. But one of the things that you're going to see is there's some things that I really, really like. So I actually wrote a list of some of the things that I love. It's not a comprehensive list. There's actually something, like whatever, but this is at least a good start of here's some things that Pastor Nate loves. I love God, right? Which is an important step one. This is like an important thing. I love his word. I love the way that God reveals himself and speaks through his word. But I love God. I love my family. Man, I love my family. My daughters and my wife. I love my family. I love the outdoors. I love hunting. I love hunting. Yeah. And I love barbecue. Okay. And so this is how I know that this is true, that these categories are accurate in terms of like the things that I love. It's because my wife says, it's amazing how every conversation that you have with someone eventually lands on one or more of these 5 things. Right? It's just a matter of time until the conversation takes a turn towards one of these categories. So I love barbecue. We'll just hang on this one for just a second. So as we get to know each other, and maybe as we connect on social media, you'll start to see that, man, like Nate really enjoys like smoking meat, and like he's like pretty serious about his proteins. It's a big deal for me, right? So we look at this, and I've got like secret recipes, so much so when we lived in Colorado, I had a fake recipe for a rub. I had made the rub, and then I wrote a fake recipe on it, so when people would look in my cabinet, sort of try and figure out what it was wrong, right? Which is just... Barbecue guys, we're weird. It's like a hunting spot. We don't talk about it. It's like generally like in the Vatterly direction is where we hunt, right? But say we're in conversation and you're saying, look, Pastor Nate, I know like barbecue, there's a kind of like magician never shows his tricks, those kinds of things, but man, like I've got this big meal coming up. I've got people coming over. I've got this thing that I want to make sure I get it right. Could you share a recipe for me that's like just a guaranteed win? And I might start to describe a process for you where it's like, well, there's a brisket recipe that, man, I just think is fantastic. Right, so here's what you're going to do. And I describe to you the process of, you go to the butcher shop or you go to the grocery, and it's like there's different options. There's different kinds and cuts of brisket, right? It's not just brisket. There's different like categories, those kinds of things. But I'm going to talk to you about like how much marbling you're going to want in the meat. And we're going to talk really specifically about the cut and how to like be really discerning in the choice of brisket. Just like this is like the main ingredient, right? And then I'm going to talk about this process. And I'm going to talk about maybe that you're going to get some salt, and not just like regular salt, get kosher salt, right? It matters. And sugar and some garlic powder, and we're going to talk about quantities, and I'm going to talk about the different things, and I'm going to describe this rub and the work that you're going to do to get this brisket ready for this special meal. And then I'm going to talk about your smoker, and we're going to talk about maybe the kinds of wood that would be a good idea for you to use as you're smoking. And then we're going to talk, man, this is like really dangerous to do anytime close to lunch, but we're going to talk about the way you're going to put that brisket in your smoker and just the change that you're going to see happen as that thing goes, right? And it's like, just starts to really render down, and you're going to like spray some apple juice on it along the way, and then you're going to like wrap it. There's all sorts of things, but by the time it's done, this thing is going to be just perfect. And so we finish this conversation, and just as you're starting to walk away with confidence level that's like through the roof of being successful in this, right? Probably like ready to go buy brisket and like all this kind of stuff. You might turn and say, so, okay, how was it? Right? Like when you've made this, when you have made this brisket, how did it turn out? And your confidence level, we're talking, it's high, right? If I responded and said, well, I've actually never made this particular recipe before, but man, I read about it on the internet and it just sounds like such a good idea. Your confidence level, right? We can do this right now. It's like it goes from here to like down here somewhere. Our credibility as followers of Jesus, our credibility in the stories that we tell and the way that we live our lives, our credibility is in the making of the brisket, not just talking about the brisket, not having like opinions and ideas about the way to make brisket. It's when we actually do the thing, when we actually take what we have learned and we apply it to a particular practice, to the act of living. And so the invitation this morning is very, very simple. For some of us, it's an invitation to faith. right? It's an invitation to lay down maybe the works that we have been trying to do to impress God, to have a transaction with God, to create a healthy relationship with him based on our efforts. It's an invitation to lay that down and to take hold of faith. It's also good news, right? It's good news that our good deeds can't save us. Because for some of us, it's really good news that the things that we have done, the stuff that we've done in our past, the mistakes that we've made, can't disqualify us once we have placed those in Jesus' hand and asked him to forgive us for what we've done, right? Our good deeds can't save us, and our past misdeeds, once forgiven, cannot disqualify us from a relationship with God. We're invited to faith, and we're invited to life in Christ. This is us responding with our lives to the invitation that Jesus has made a way for us to lean into, right? This is us responding with the way we actually live, to apply faith to the act of living, letting our doing flow out of the what has been done for us. This is active, having made the brisket kind of faith, right? It's such a beautiful way of living. It's such a wild way of living. It's a way of saying, I don't want to just know about stuff, and I don't want to just strive in a meaningless kind of way. I want to take hold of the whole of what God has invited me into. It's a making the brisket kind of faith. Maybe it doesn't take us to this big gesture in Africa, but it takes us in intentional ways in conversations and relationships with others. It takes faith and applies it to our decision making. It takes faith and applies it to the way that we parent. It takes faith and applies it to the way we operate within our workplaces. It takes faith, and it changes the way we live. And as we live this out, this is what is so beautiful about this. What's so beautiful about the people who James was initially writing this letter to. It's what's so beautiful about the way this looks lived out in our lives now 2,000 years later. As we live this out, our stories become an invitation for others to join us on this journey as well. This is the move where make the brisket turns into to share the brisket, right? Where others are finding hope and peace and faith because of the work that God is doing, not just in us, but through us as well. This is faith unleashed in and through our lives. Let's pray. God, thank you. God, thank you for the gift that your Son, Jesus Christ, is for us. God, thank you for an invitation to a life that isn't just knowing or just doing, but God takes us into the wild unknown of leaning in and taking hold of who you are and the life that you've called us to. God, I pray that as a people, we'd be found faithful in this, that we would know you well, but then, God, that we would take what we know about you and we would allow you to work in and through our lives. God, may we not be a people who just talk about stuff, but God, may we be a make the brisket kind of people. And so we pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. God, with gratitude for what he's done for us. It's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.